He was born a prince. He became a god, and then a monster. He turned the Roman Empire into his playground. He made senators crawl and begged gods to envy him. He killed for sport. He laughed at pain. And yes, he tried to marry his horse. This is not mythology. This is Rome. This is Caligula, the emperor who lost his mind. History remembers his madness. But behind the legend is a study of power, paranoia, and the human mind unchained. For more stories where genius and insanity share the same crown, subscribe and keep exploring the minds that ruled the world and destroyed themselves doing it. He wasn't born a monster. Rome made him one. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus came into the world in the year 12 AD, at the height of Roman power. The empire ruled from desert to ocean. Marble and blood built its peace. His father, Germanicus, was the perfect Roman, handsome, loyal, adored by soldiers. Crowds threw flowers at his feet. They whispered that when old Emperor Tiberius died, Germanicus would rule. In Rome, whispers are death sentences. When Germanicus fell ill in the east and died suddenly, people murmured about poison. Everyone looked toward Tiberius. No one spoke his name aloud. The empire had learned that truth could be treason. At home, Agrippina the elder, his widow, screamed at the gods. She told her children their father was murdered. Her anger became their bedtime story. The youngest boy, Gaius, listened hardest. Soldiers had once dressed him in tiny armor and boots. They laughed and called him Caligula, Little Boots. The name stuck like a scar. Tiberius couldn't ignore Agrippina's rage. He exiled her. Then he executed her sons one after another. The child watched his family disappear. Love turned to fear. Fear hardened into silence. In Rome, survival required it. Tiberius didn't kill Caligula. He invited him to Capri, a paradise to the Senate, a prison to those inside. White marble, blue water, servants who smiled because they had to. But behind the beauty lay the emperor's madness. On Capri, pleasure and punishment were the same thing. Servants vanished. Senators fell from cliffs. Blood washed away in the sea. The boy learned quickly. He learned when to laugh, when to bow, when to disappear. He watched the emperor's eyes for warning signs. Every scream on that island became another lesson. Fear was the law. Power meant survival. Mercy was suicide. At night he stared into the dark Mediterranean. He imagined his mother's exile, his brothers strangled. He whispered that one day he would never be afraid again. Years passed. The emperor aged into paranoia. His villa became silent except for waves and whispers. Tiberius tested the boy's loyalty with cruelty, ordering executions and watching if Caligula flinched. He never did. He smiled, calm, obedient, perfect. He became what Tiberius wanted. And that was the beginning of everything. When Tiberius died, some said the old emperor's last words were, "Let them kill each other." He wasn't wrong. Rome erupted with celebration. The Senate proclaimed Caligula emperor. He was 24, young, handsome, the son of a hero. Crowds filled the streets shouting his name. They said the golden age had returned. They believed mercy had finally conquered fear. For 6 months it looked true. He freed prisoners. He paid soldiers their overdue wages. He rebuilt temples, reopened theaters, hosted games for the people. Rome adored him. The Senate praised him as generous, kind, a mirror of the gods. Mothers lifted their children to see him pass. Merchants hung his image in their shops. The city that once lived in terror finally smiled again. Then, in his 7th month of rule, everything changed. The sickness struck suddenly, a fever so violent that he screamed through nights and drifted toward death. He babbled about voices and visions. He said he saw Germanicus in the firelight. He said the gods spoke to him. For weeks Rome waited, holding its breath. The empire prayed to every god it knew. When he finally opened his eyes, the empire celebrated. Bells rang. Priests offered sacrifices. The savior of Rome had survived. But the man who rose from that bed was not the same one who fell into it. Something had burned away in the fever. Maybe fear, maybe empathy, maybe reality itself. He stood at the palace window, thin and pale, and told his guards that death had rejected him, that he had crossed the line between man and God. They laughed softly, thinking it was metaphor. It wasn't. Within days, he stopped addressing the Senate as equals. He started calling them servants. He ordered them to kneel. He told them that the empire existed only because he breathed. When one senator hesitated, Caligula smiled and said, "Do you envy my divinity?" The next morning, the man was found dead. The fever had not just scarred his body, it had rewired his mind. And Rome, still cheering, didn't notice. At first he hid the madness behind charm. He spoke beautifully, promised reforms, kissed babies, fed the poor. But the smiles were rehearsed. Behind the polished speeches, the same thought repeated in his head, "I am untouchable." He began to sleep less. He wandered the palace at night, muttering to unseen listeners. Guards heard him talking to the moon. He claimed it followed him. He told servants that Jupiter visited his dreams. He wrote letters to the gods and burned them as offerings. Something inside him had cracked permanently. The boy who learned fear had become the man who could no longer feel it. And when a ruler stops fearing consequence, the line between empire and experiment disappears. By the end of his first year as emperor, Caligula had everything he had ever wanted: power, wealth, worship. But inside, the lessons of Capri still whispered, power is safety. Fear is control. Kindness dies first. He remembered every scream from that island and began to make new ones. At first, Caligula still wore the mask that Rome had fallen in love with. He walked through the forum smiling, shaking hands, promising a better age. But the smile was empty. Behind his eyes, something cold had taken root. The fever had left him with headaches that never stopped. He saw flashes of light, heard voices, felt his pulse as thunder in his skull. Doctors called it exhaustion. It was the sound of a brain unraveling. He began to change the palace itself. Gold on every wall, new statues of himself rising where the gods once stood. He told artists to carve his face on Jupiter's body. He said the people should pray to what they could see. The marble dust filled the air like smoke. At banquets, he ordered every guest to toast him as a living deity. Those who hesitated disappeared before morning. He said their silence proved guilt. He was surrounded by applause and corpses. In the Senate chamber, he spoke less of law and more of revelation. He claimed the gods had chosen him to cleanse Rome of hypocrisy. He called mercy weakness. He called fear loyalty. He began signing decrees as Caligula Caesar the Divine. His illness fed his ego, and his ego fed the illness. He slept 3 hours a night. He walked the corridors talking to himself. He spoke of shadows that followed him, voices that warned him. He told the guards that Jupiter whispered plans for him to rule the world. He invited the high priests to dinner. They expected prayer. He served them blood. He said it was sacred. He drank first and ordered them to follow. Some vomited. He laughed until tears ran down his face. He began rebuilding the bridge between his palace and the temple of Jupiter. He said it would allow him to walk among the gods as their equal. He crossed it barefoot one night, carrying a torch, whispering to the dark sky, "Now I am one of you." The people below watched the flame move across the roofline and called it a miracle. They wanted to believe. Rome always wanted to believe in something, but miracles cost money. He started new taxes, sold public offices, seized estates. He threw games to distract the crowd. 50,000 watched men die to prove the emperor's generosity. He said the roar of the arena was the empire's heartbeat. Each cheer was proof that he existed. The Senate began to sense the danger. They met in private, whispering of limits, of balance, of sanity. But every senator remembered what happened to the last man who hesitated. They voted yes to everything. They clapped until their hands bled. Caligula saw their fear and mistook it for worship. He believed he had succeeded where Tiberius failed. He ruled not just bodies, but minds. He started to see himself in every reflection. He ordered mirrors placed in every hallway. He said he liked to watch divinity move. He spoke often of his father Germanicus. He said he could still feel him in the air. He ordered sacrifices in his memory, but ended each prayer with, "I am greater." He began to tell people he had surpassed his father, surpassed all men, surpassed death itself. The insomnia worsened. He drifted through nights half awake, half dreaming, surrounded by candles and statues of gods wearing his face. He told attendants that the moon was jealous of his light. He shouted at storms and demanded they end. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Either way, he said he had won. He no longer trusted anyone. He tested loyalty with cruelty. He would give a man gold one day and order him executed the next. He said it kept destiny interested. Modern psychiatrists would call it delusional grandiosity mixed with mania and trauma-induced paranoia. But in Rome there were no doctors for minds, only executioners and poets. The empire adjusted to his rhythm. Fear became currency. Silence became wisdom. Even laughter became dangerous. He once said, "If they fear me, they love me." That was the gospel according to Caligula. Late one night he gathered his guards. He told them the gods had spoken again. He was to expand the empire, not through conquest, but through faith. He said every heart in Rome must worship him completely. He asked if they believed. They answered yes, because the alternative was death. He smiled and whispered, "Then Rome is reborn." The next morning, new statues appeared in the Forum, Caligula crowned with rays of the sun, arms spread like a savior. The crowd bowed. The senators bowed. Even the priests bowed. But behind the marble, something was breaking. The man who once freed prisoners now built invisible prisons inside every mind around him. He had survived Tiberius by pretending to be perfect. Now he demanded the same perfection from the world. When it failed him, he would punish it, and the punishment was only beginning. Caligula's transformation from ruler to deity didn't happen overnight. It spread like infection. At first, it looked like eccentricity. Rome had seen strange emperors before, but what set Caligula apart was conviction. He didn't pretend to be a god. He believed it. He began referring to himself as Jupiter made flesh. He demanded that every law, every decree, every oath begin with his name. The Senate agreed without a word. They had seen what happened to men who disagreed. He commissioned a new temple, dedicated not to the old gods, but to Caligula Caesar, son of Germanicus, lord of heaven and earth. He ordered priests to offer daily sacrifices to his statue. He built altars where people once prayed to Jupiter. Now they prayed to him. He declared that he could hear the prayers of his subjects wherever they were. He said their thoughts were his music. He began to test them. He'd summon a senator in the middle of the night and ask what he had dreamed. If the answer displeased him, the man disappeared before sunrise. At the palace, rituals replaced meetings. Gold lamps burned day and night. The smell of incense clung to every robe, every wall. Statues of Caligula lined the corridors, each one different. Caligula as Apollo, Caligula as Mercury, Caligula as Venus. He walked among them, touching their faces, whispering, "You are me." The palace became both church and asylum. Visitors described him pacing the marble floors barefoot, muttering to invisible companions. Sometimes he laughed until he coughed blood. Sometimes he screamed until guards wept from fear. He claimed Jupiter argued with him, that they were equals, sometimes enemies. He told his attendants that the gods had shown him the true nature of the universe, chaos, beauty, and cruelty intertwined. He said ordinary men couldn't see it because they feared death. He didn't fear death anymore. He said he had already met it and returned. He began to control his image obsessively. Sculptors were forced to recarve his face on old monuments. Coins were melted and reminted with his portrait radiating divine light. He said Rome should see his perfection every time it touched money. He turned currency into worship. He demanded that crowds address him not as emperor, but as God. When a few men hesitated, he had them executed in public. Their blood stained the steps of his temple. He said the gods accepted their offering. Behind the displays of grandeur, his mind deteriorated further. He trusted no one, not even his guards. He changed sleeping rooms every night. He had walls drilled with holes so he could spy on servants. He listened at doors. He recorded names. The island lessons of Capri had returned. He began to dream of conquest, not of land, but of faith. He wanted the gods of every nation to bow to him. He ordered his image sent to every temple in the empire. In Judea, when priests refused to place it in their sanctuary, he nearly sent an army. He said their God would learn humility. Only his advisors' desperation stopped him. He grew obsessed with omens and prophecies. When lightning struck near the palace, he laughed and shouted to the sky, "Now we are equals." He built new shrines at the site, turning superstition into spectacle. He no longer saw distinction between theater and reality. He appeared in the arena dressed as Hercules, demanding that gladiators fight him. He would wound them lightly, then declare victory as the crowd cheered through clenched teeth. He believed he was proving immortality. Modern neurologists suspect temporal lobe epilepsy mixed with psychotic breaks. Episodes of euphoria, followed by exhaustion and rage. He experienced visions, auditory hallucinations, manic energy, complete lack of empathy. The fever that almost killed him had left the wiring of his brain changed forever. He lived trapped between divinity and delusion. He began to equate suffering with proof of holiness. When a close friend questioned his cruelty, Caligula answered, "Pain is the breath of gods." He said only through pain could men recognize power. He ordered the man whipped until he lost consciousness, then rewarded him with gold. As months passed, the boundaries between his body and the empire blurred. He referred to Rome as "my flesh." He said its rivers were his veins. He claimed storms were his thoughts made visible. He said when people disobeyed him, they were like cells of a body infected with sin, and infection had to be burned. He began to burn entire neighborhoods as purification. He watched the fires from his balcony, eyes glowing in the reflection. He said the flames were prayers. He spent more time alone. Those who saw him described a face that no longer matched its fame. Gaunt, twitching, pale from insomnia. He rubbed his temples constantly, as if trying to hold his skull together. He spoke softly now, always about destiny. He said he would not die until the world learned to love him properly. Then he said he would ascend. The Senate met in whispers. Some believed they served a prophet. Most knew they served a disease. And outside the palace, in taverns and marketplaces, people began to tell stories. Stories of an emperor who could control lightning, who could speak to animals, who could walk through fire untouched. Fear had turned myth into faith, and faith had turned madness into rule. The story of Caligula's horse, Incitatus, has survived 2,000 years because it reveals the depth of his delusion. In the city where senators debated law and poets wrote of virtue, the emperor loved a horse more than any man. Incitatus was not a symbol at first. It was real, a racing stallion Caligula had owned since before his fever. He watched it run as others watched the stars. He said it was pure, loyal, incapable of lies. He built it a marble stable with walls painted blue to mimic the sky. He fed it oats mixed with gold leaf. He said the animal understood him when people didn't. Soon, the horse became sacred. He invited it to dinner, a jeweled collar around its neck. He made senators sit and toast it as the most honest citizen of Rome. No one dared laugh. He announced that Incitatus would soon be consul, the highest political office in the empire. Whether it was sarcasm or sincerity stopped mattering. Truth had lost its place in Rome. Caligula said the horse listened better than the Senate. He told his advisors that animals were closer to the gods than men. He said human speech was poison, only silence was loyal. When a servant accidentally startled the horse, he ordered the man executed. He said the punishment was mercy compared to betrayal. Modern historians sometimes say it was satire, Caligula mocking the Senate's corruption. But the accounts from witnesses show something worse. He believed in Incitatus the way priests believe in their gods. It wasn't humor. It was hallucination wrapped in logic. This was how his mind worked now. A thought became law. A fantasy became history. A whim became worship. The horse wasn't the only symbol of his unraveling. At night, he would climb to the palace roof and speak to the moon. He said the moon followed him because it was lonely too. Guards heard him whispering, asking if it envied him. He ordered sacrifices to it. He said the silver glow was its blood. He spent hours staring into mirrors, turning his head side to side, searching for proof of divinity. He claimed he could see light around himself. He said it was his halo. He told the people he could not be killed because death feared him. To prove it, he demanded an executioner strike at him with a sword. The man hesitated. Caligula laughed and said, "See, even steel obeys me," but the paranoia kept growing. He accused his own guards of plotting against him. He replaced them weekly. He forced his servants to taste his food in front of him and then eat again, so they could die if it was poisoned. He even began testing the loyalty of his mistresses, questioning them for hours, demanding they confess imaginary sins. His sister Drusilla had been his anchor. She was the one person who could soothe his rages. Some said their bond was unnatural, but to Caligula, she was the only piece of family he had left. When she died suddenly, fever, miscarriage, maybe suicide, he broke beyond repair. He declared her divine. He ordered the creation of a temple with her statue crowned among the stars. He called her the goddess Drusilla, bride of heaven. He told the people that she still spoke to him. He said she guided his hand when he signed decrees. He held public ceremonies in her honor and demanded others weep as he wept. He turned her death into religion and his grief into governance. He banned laughter for a week. Anyone who smiled was accused of mocking her. Dozens died for forgetting how to mourn correctly. After that, cruelty became his only language. He said fear was the purest prayer. He called execution sacrifices. He turned the palace into a stage where faith and pain were the same performance. He began staging mock trials where guilt was decided by whim. He made senators crawl across the floor and beg for forgiveness they didn't understand. He told them their humiliation was sacred purification. He stopped distinguishing between spectacle and state. He demanded that every festival honor him. He even had statues of himself dressed as Venus, the goddess of love, carried through the streets. He said divinity had no gender. It was beyond human definition. He said he contained all gods within him, male, female, beast, spirit. In his mind, he was no longer emperor. He was the center of existence. He said the stars moved because he willed them to. He said every heartbeat in Rome was his echo, and still, part of him knew he was mortal. That part was terrified. He began collecting poisons, fearing assassination. He built secret tunnels under the palace to escape unseen. He rehearsed dying in front of mirrors, practicing how a god should fall. Psychologists today would call it a psychotic collapse mixed with megalomania and trauma response. He was both the scared child of Capri and the self-proclaimed god of the world. Each side fueled the other. The child feared death. The god denied it. The Rome that once cheered his name now whispered it only in curses. Merchants refused to hang his image. Families destroyed his coins. The empire that had worshipped him now prayed for his absence. But madness doesn't stop when people stop believing. It only grows louder in the silence, and Caligula was listening to that silence more than ever. By 40 AD, Rome was drowning in silence. The cheers that once filled the streets were gone. Every citizen, every senator, every slave lived in the same quiet calculation. What word, what glance, what breath might end my life today? Because in Caligula's Rome, survival was not about loyalty. It was about luck. The emperor's madness was no longer rumor. It was policy. He had turned the empire into a theater of cruelty. Every day the audience changed. Every day the script was written in blood. He had drained the treasury on games and monuments to himself. To refill it, he invented taxes. Absurd, endless, humiliating. He taxed marriages, lawsuits, and inheritances. He taxed the wages of soldiers and the profits of merchants. He even taxed the sale of prostitutes and the gambling of dice. When that wasn't enough, he taxed breathing. He said air was the emperor's property. He confiscated estates of nobles who displeased him. He auctioned their possessions publicly, shouting bids like a street vendor. He laughed as the senators fought over their own furniture, desperate to appear grateful. He said Rome was his body and that he could cut into it whenever he pleased. The city began to rot from the inside. He demanded worship in every province. In Judea, he ordered a colossal statue of himself, built for the Temple of Jerusalem. When the Jewish priests refused, he called them ungrateful and nearly sent an army to slaughter them. He said their God should thank him for existing. Only the desperate pleading of his governors stopped the bloodbath. He saw rebellion in every silence. When storms ruined crops, he accused farmers of conspiracy with the gods. He burned their homes and called it purification. He said smoke carried prayers better than words. He commanded armies for no reason. He led legions to the northern coast and ordered them to attack the ocean. They stood on the shore, spears raised, waves breaking at their feet. He shouted at the sea god Neptune, demanding tribute. When the waves didn't respond, he ordered soldiers to collect seashells. He called them the spoils of war. He marched back to Rome in triumph, wagons full of shells, banners waving. The Senate had to declare it victory. They clapped until their hands blistered. By now, his bodyguards had learned to read his moods like weather. One wrong word could bring lightning. He once executed a soldier for wearing a sword that looked too proud. He said arrogance was treason. He said fear was discipline. His cruelty became creative. He turned executions into entertainment. He invited nobles to dinner, served them wine, and then signaled their deaths between courses. He watched the killings calmly while musicians played. He said harmony required sacrifice. He forced senators to watch their wives humiliated, then offered them gold for not crying. He made fathers choose which of their children would live. He said gods must test faith. Every act of violence had logic in his mind. It wasn't madness to him, it was symmetry. He told his court that the universe was chaos and that he, the divine mind, brought order through death. He believed killing proved control. The more he killed, the safer he felt. Psychiatrists now call this compulsion repetition trauma, the victim reenacting cruelty to feel powerful again. Caligula was the child of Capri, endlessly repeating Tiberius's lessons. Fear works, empathy dies first. Even his laughter changed. Those who heard it said it no longer sounded human. It was high, thin, endless, the sound of a man drowning in himself. He began to appear in public less often. When he did, he was unpredictable. Some days he threw gold coins to the crowd. Other days he ordered guards to cut down anyone who caught them. He said fortune favored the brave, and bravery meant surviving him. He grew thinner, paler. His insomnia worsened. He ate little except fruit soaked in wine. He claimed normal food made him mortal. He spoke to mirrors and shadows. He said he saw gods standing behind him. He told his guards that Jupiter warned him of plots. He started having the palace walls repainted every week to hide invisible messages. He had entire wings of the palace rebuilt because he said the marble was whispering betrayal. His power had become its own religion, a cult of fear that fed on blood. Even his victims began to see him as divine. One senator before execution thanked him for allowing him to die in the presence of a god. Caligula smiled and said, "You understand." Outside Rome, governors ruled cautiously, unsure what insanity might be decreed next. The legions grumbled. The treasury was empty again. But still, the statues rose. Still, the temples to Caligula shone under the sun. Rome had learned to worship the disease that was killing it. Behind closed doors, the whispers began, not among slaves or citizens, but among soldiers. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, had lost fathers, brothers, and wives to his rages. They began to meet in secret. They spoke not of rebellion, but of cure. By the end of the year, the empire was no longer ruled by law, or by faith, or even by madness. It was ruled by exhaustion. Every mind, every heart, every breath bent beneath the same weight, waiting for the end. The only question left was who would break first, Rome or its god. The end began not with rebellion, but with fatigue. By the winter of 41 AD, even the soldiers had stopped pretending to believe. The empire was dying in spirit long before the emperor did. Caligula still walked the marble halls of his palace like a ghost that refused to vanish. He was 28 years old and looked twice that. His face was pale, his hands trembled. The once bright eyes were sunken and restless. He spoke less, but when he did, his words were sharp, broken fragments of prophecy. He said the world would end if he slept. He said the moon watched him and waited. He said Jupiter had promised him eternity, but only through blood. The palace was silent most days. Guards moved like shadows. Servants whispered prayers as they passed him. He no longer cared for politics or ceremony. He lived inside his head, in a world of gods and fears. Reality had shrunk to match his madness. The empire functioned without him now. His advisors signed decrees in his name, trying to keep the machine alive. But even they knew it couldn't last. The people starved. The soldiers grumbled. The treasury was dust. Caligula no longer noticed. He spent hours staring into mirrors, asking if he could see the god behind his reflection. Sometimes he threw the mirrors against the wall and demanded new ones. He said the glass had forgotten who he was. At night he walked through empty corridors lined with gold. He dragged his fingers along the walls, as if feeling the pulse of the empire. He said it was dying, but that he would not die with it. He said gods do not fall, they are only betrayed. His paranoia had grown into prophecy. He accused Jupiter's priests of plotting against him. He accused his own guards of whispering in their sleep. He accused the heir of carrying treason. He had entire families executed for glancing at each other during his processions. One morning, he ordered a feast in the theater attached to his palace. He said it was to celebrate his divinity renewed. The senators came dressed in white. The guards lined the corridors. The smell of incense and fear filled the air. The conspirators were among them, officers of the Praetorian Guard, men who had once sworn to protect him. Their leader was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran he had humiliated too many times. Caligula mocked his voice, called him weak, made him kiss his boots in front of the troops. That day, Chaerea smiled for the first time in years. The games ended near dusk. Caligula, drunk and euphoric, left the stage and entered the tunnel beneath the theater. He was laughing about omens when the first blow came. A sword slashed across his neck. He turned, shocked, not afraid, only offended. The second strike drove through his chest. The third went deep enough to silence him. He fell to the marble floor gasping. For a moment, no one moved. Then Cassius stepped forward and delivered the final thrust. The god of Rome died like a man, bleeding, confused and mortal. His body lay where it fell. The guards, who weren't part of the plot, fled. The conspirators looked at each other, half in horror, half in relief. It was done. When news reached the city, the reaction was chaos. Some screamed that Jupiter himself had struck him down. Others shouted that justice had returned. Crowds poured into the streets not to mourn, but to breathe. The air felt lighter. Rome felt alive again. The Senate met in secret. They ordered his statues smashed, his name erased from inscriptions. They called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, as if erasing him could erase what he had revealed about them all. Because Caligula wasn't a monster from nowhere. He was Rome made flesh, its greed, its fear, its hunger for power, all concentrated in one fragile mind. He was the consequence of empire itself. Modern psychiatrists see him as the perfect case study. The trauma of childhood violence, the neurological damage from fever, the manic delusions of absolute authority. His brain was a storm that no one could stop feeding. Every worshipper, every fear, every cheer made the storm stronger. He was the first Roman emperor to make his madness divine, but not the last. After him came others, Nero, Commodus, Elagabalus, each repeating the same disease of power. Caligula wasn't an exception. He was the pattern. If he lived today, doctors might diagnose him. They might treat him with medication, therapy, compassion. But in ancient Rome, gods didn't need doctors. And madness, when given a throne, always crowns itself divine. His body was burned in secret by his remaining servants. His ashes were buried quietly on the Esquiline hill, away from public eyes. The palace was cleansed with salt and smoke. The Senate hoped that by purging his memory, they could restore order. But memory lingers, whispers linger. Even now, 2 millennia later, his name still means chaos. Caligula wanted immortality. And he got it. Not as a god, as a warning. because the lesson he left behind is timeless. Power doesn't corrupt the pure, it exposes the damaged. Give a frightened child a throne, and he will turn it into a fortress. Give a broken mind a crown, and it will call itself divine. Caligula was not simply mad. He was the mirror that showed humanity what it looks like without restraint. His empire fell, his temples burned, but his disease, the hunger to be worshipped, the urge to dominate, the belief that fear is love, survived every century. In every age, another Caligula waits. Not always in marble palaces, sometimes in boardrooms, sometimes behind podiums, sometimes inside us, and so his ghost remains, not as spirit but as pattern. The boy who watched Rome burn, the man who married his own madness, the god who learned he could bleed. He achieved the immortality he wanted, not through divinity but through diagnosis. The emperor who proved that the line between power and psychosis is thinner than history admits. Caligula, the god who devoured himself. His story isn't about Rome, it's about what happens when power becomes therapy for pain, when trauma meets empire, when fear learns to rule. For more stories where history meets psychology, subscribe and keep exploring the minds that shaped the world and the darkness that shaped them.